Um, I'm Kate Macmillan. I'm your coordinator of library services for the district. And I have the honor of introducing Daniel Nayeri to you. And I'm a little bit long introduction, but I have some words to say. I first heard Daniel Nayeri speak at a librarians conference a few months ago. I hadn't even read the book, but his story had a personal meaning for me because I spent part of my childhood in Iran and have even been to Isfahan, the city where he was born. Daniel and I quickly became email friends. I knew that he was a refugee and probably wasn't able to bring many personal belongings with him. So I sent photos of Persian artwork that I had. And to make a long story short, I actually Googled one of the artists and found that his son is a professor at UC Berkeley. So you can see Daniel's story created another connection. I know this is a long introduction, but I wanted you to understand that all our stories have the power to reconnect people and keep memories alive. Hopefully, you will be like Daniel and become keepers of stories. And there you have it, Daniel. It's your turn now.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Kate. That is a gorgeous introduction. And an honor. Thank you for having me. In general, I was going to begin by telling you a little bit about myself and about this book, which is called Everything Sad is Untrue, a True Story. It's really easy to do both at the same time because the book is actually the story of my life. It's about me when I grew up, as Kate said, in Isfahan in Iran, and where my mother got a fatwa on her head, which is sort of a term we use for, had committed a capital crime. And a capital crime, of course, is a crime for which, if you're found guilty, you'll be killed. And so what was her crime? Well, her crime in this case was that she converted from her religion, and that is against the law. And so we were sent. So we escaped from Iran when I was very young. I was about 6 years old. And we're refugees for about a year and a half. And during that time, when you're a refugee, you're part of the global homeless, which means that, the term for a refugee is someone who is, in danger from their country of origin. Obviously, you're a citizen of a country. The expectation is that your government will protect you. And so when that isn't the case, when you're found when you find yourself in a situation like that, and it happens, for a variety of reasons. It might be civil wars or fairly bad reasons usually. You end up going to another country, and the life of a refugee is one where you're trying to find a new home. So what you do is you end up in a waiting facility, and some people call those refugee camps, or wherever basically you can sort of lay down your head, because you've got to wait a while. What you're doing with your days is you're going to different embassies. So it may be the embassy for the United States or for Canada, Australia, you name it. First, you got to find them, then you got to do all this paperwork. You have to apply for what they call asylum. And asylum is basically the legal term for when a country is going to let you in and let you start working toward becoming a citizen of their country. And to do that, it takes a lot of work because there's a lot of interviews that are involved, right? And they're interviewing you for a whole host of reasons. Make sure you're not lying about who you are. All these different things. And so during that year and a half, it's a really challenging time, right? As I just said, you're spending a lot of your time in embassies, or you're waiting. There's not a lot of time for schooling. There's not a lot of time for, vacationing, any of that good stuff. So you're trying to figure out what's going to happen. And also there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't really know if you're going to, landing in the United States or landing in Australia or landing in France, these are, or anywhere, Argentina, any of these places are going to be very different places. And even just getting ready for them is challenging, right? So a lot of that is still up in the air. So we were doing that. We went to 2 countries. One was UAE, which is, it's 12 emirates, which are like principalities, right? And so people know Abu Dhabi or Dubai. Those are 2 of them. And then from there, we went to a refugee camp in the outskirts of Rome, which was in Italy, of course. And from there, we finally got asylum to the United States in Oklahoma. And that's where the book starts. It sort of opens in a class like yours. And, you know, with a report, the kid is standing there. The kid is me. His name is Khosrow. And he's trying to explain his life, right? It's one of these classic kind of reports you might get at the beginning of the year. It's like, what did I do with my summer kind of report, right? Well, he's trying to explain all this. And he's realizing that in order to explain why he's there, he has to explain why he's a refugee. And in order to explain why he's a refugee, he's got to explain why his mother sort of has a fatwa. And in order to explain that, he has to explain the history of Iran and the culture and the laws and the sort of religious history. And he goes even further back. He finally has to just explain the mythology and the family stories that he came up with. And as he's doing that, the classmates, they're getting more and more incredulous, right? They're sort of like, they're not really believing him. And so he starts to feel like Scheherazade. Scheherazade is the great like storyteller of Iranian culture. She's part of a series of books called the Arabian Nights, right? And these were an oral tradition of stories. And they always begin with Scheherazade, this, you know, she's a hero who is in with this murderous king, and she's telling him a story in order to distract him. Her story is so good and ends with so many cliffhangers that every night, instead of killing her, he spares her life, and she gets to continue to tell the story for 1,001 nights. So that you can imagine is a very skeptical audience, is a very dangerous place to be telling stories. And he sort of starts to feel as if the skepticism of his audience feels a little, it's not exactly murder, it's like social, you know, being a social outcast and that sort of thing. And so he's telling those stories, and it's all kind of interweaving, and he's telling the memories of his childhood and continuing to kind of try to make his way in Oklahoma, where those sort of two cultures are very particularly different. Until finally, and this is the spoiler, I won't give you the exact ending, but at the end, he hears that his father, who had chosen to stay in Iran, is going to come visit the class. He's going to come to Oklahoma. He's going to visit America, and he's going to come to the class. And this is the moment where the kid Khosrow is terrified, right? Because were his memories accurate? Like, is his father, who he's been describing as this, you know, great man of poetry and letters, and who is heroic and large in stature, is he going to be like that, or is he just some guy, right? He's just some normal dad. And what's that going to be like? Will he end up sort of disproving his own story? So the story kind of goes till that climax where the dad shows up, and we'll see what happens. But that all was sort of my life in middle school until I kept going. Right around middle school, around that time, I actually knew I wanted to be a storyteller. Because of this exact thing. Anytime I would meet with a friend's parents, or I would go to see if some kid could play soccer or whatnot, you know, the parents would kind of ask about you. They kind of say like, hey, you know, who are you? Where are you from? And very quickly I would have to tell this story as quickly as I possibly could, because I had no interest in standing around on their front porch telling them my whole life story when I could be playing with their kids. So I got really good at telling the story very, very fast. And they would become more curious. They'd be like, oh, wait, where in Iran? And what about your uncles? And I would try to like really quickly wrap this up, because I got to get going. And so I ended up falling in love with storytelling, with ways in which you can kind of tell the same story 1,000 different ways. And so I went to school for writing and editing and publishing. That's what I studied at university in New York. And around that time, after I got out, I went into editing books. And so I was still in New York. I was living in this like really small apartment with 3 guys. To help you visualize how small, I had to build bunk beds so that we could actually fit ourselves into this. It was a very small apartment. And one day my dad called, right? As I said, he stayed in Iran. I hadn't seen him for 20 years, ever since that part in the book where he visits Oklahoma. And he called and he said, how are you? Can you talk? And there was no place to have privacy in this apartment except for the bathroom. So I go into the bathroom and I sit down, and he tells me the sad news that my grandfather, one of the main characters of this book, the character who this boy kind of looks up to, who's sort of like the great leader of the family who could teach him how to be a shepherd, and had all these orchards that he tended. He was a great farmer, and he told me that grandfather had died. And I remember sitting there in that bathroom thinking, wow, I'm never going to have another memory with this man. He's passed. I somewhere in the back of my head, I always thought I could go back and see him again, but that's not going to be possible. And so I had this sudden feeling of wanting to count and like measure and document every memory I had of him. But I call him, he's my Baba Haji. Every memory of my Baba Haji. And so as I did, it's sort of where the story started. If you've started the book already, he's sort of counting his memories. He's trying really hard to hold on to them because he's aware that he's never going to have any again. That was the same impulse. I just had it much later in life. I had it when I was 28. That got me to sit down and start writing it. It took another 13 years to actually, so I wasn't 28. It was, let's see, I got to do the math, because it was late 20s. I finished when I was 37. So 13 years before that, I finished, and that took just, more than a decade of drafts. I'm sure we can talk about that in the question and answer section, but it really began as a bunch of essays. I thought I could write them, as, like little personal essays without any of the kind of trappings of a fiction novel. It ended up kind of sounding a little too academic and a little too serious. I wanted it to be fun. I wanted it to be emotional. And so I had a friend, actually, I was having cupcakes with her and I was complaining about how poorly it was going. And she just goes, why don't you write it from the age you were at when it happened? Like, why don't you just go into that mindset and write the novel? And I thought, wow, she's right. That was the moment when all these emotions were at their height. It felt the most, with the highest stakes. And so I did, and that still took a few years, but that was when it really unlocked, and I ended up writing this book. So that's it. That's the whole life story, plus a book report, plus how the book happened. We did it. I don't know how long that took, but thank you for letting me. And I think the next part is the Q&A, right? I got a thumbs up. She's walking across the room. The hardest sentence to write in a novel is she got up, she walked across the room, and she opened the door. Because it happens. Everybody does that. It's really boring to write. And so every writer tries to make it a little fancier, and they always get themselves into trouble at that point, right? They're like, she arose with a sigh and flounced across the room and opened the door with a flourish. Like, that's a terrible sentence. Just write, she got up, she walked across the room, and she opened the door. Really, really difficult to keep it. It's the same as chefs. You hand them a little bit of truffle oil, they pour all that truffle out, just a little bit will get you there. You know what I mean? Not too much salt.
Yes, perfect. So we're going to start calling students up. Thank you so much for that introduction. We're so excited to be here with you today. Let's give it up for everyone. Yeah, bring that question. Thank you. Perfect. Yes. And Dominic, why don't you come get ready to us? Yeah, say the question. Just say the question. Read it.
Hello. What was your best / most favorite childhood memory?
Best, most favorite child. I'll tell you, I saved it because I have always wanted to write a picture book about it, and I'm working on that now. So my grandfather, I told you, was a farmer, and he lived on the outskirts outside of Isfahan in a place called Ardestan, and it's just like beautiful. I mean, you have to imagine like awesome, landscape where there's all this sort of like, it's very arid, so it looks like Southern California. And then you come over a hill and there's this gorgeous oasis where all his orchards were, and they're like lots of fountains, a lot of trees, really green. It's lovely. But before you get there, in the part that's like a little bit more arid, a little bit more brown, there was a guy who lived by himself with his wife, and he tended all the sheep. And I knew him as the like really brave guy that you call if you find a snake, because he'll come with a rake and he will help you out. So like, he's so brave. This man can handle snakes. So I remember him with a lot of admiration, but the other thing I remember him as is that he loved kids. He and his wife couldn't have any though. And so what he decided to do was outside of his house, which was sort of halfway between the orchard, the farm, and the city, out in the middle of nowhere, he built all these toys out of scrap metal. So he would take like parts of cars and all this like whatever junk at the junkyard he could find, and he built like a Ferris wheel. It's not like a gigantic Ferris wheel, right? But it's a Ferris wheel that works. As a kid, I was like, it was so magical. It was a Ferris wheel in the middle of the desert. And we would go to it anytime we were going to my grandfather's house, and he and his wife would serve like tea and dried fruits, lots of really great snacks, and we would get to ride this guy's Ferris wheel. And I just thought it was the most magical time I had ever really had. He would also tell us a lot of stories, so he was the big storyteller in our community. And riding that Ferris wheel in the middle of sort of the desert was probably my favorite memory.
Did you like your life in Iran?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I was a little kid, so even the hard parts were kind of just like adventures for me. I was shielded from a lot of that stuff, and I mean, I had a great relationship with my dad and my grandfather. So ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a shepherd. Not really something you can do in New York City, but yeah, I enjoyed it.
My name's Caden, and
Hey, man.
what are some difficulties you faced during your travel to America?
What were some difficulties?
Yeah.
Well, in the book it mentions, boy, toilets are different. Those were hard to figure out. And then what else? I think the most difficult thing is anytime you leave somewhere familiar, trying to figure out the new place is really challenging, just because I didn't speak English very well at first. So, so if you've ever been to a place where they don't really speak your language predominantly, you're kind of at a loss. Any sign on any door could mean anything from bathroom to employees only, and you don't know. So I think the language was probably the hardest part.
All right. We're gonna go to Mateus next, because his question is a good follow-up for that.
Oh, okay.
How long did it take for you to become fluent in English?
Well, I got C's in English all through. So I landed right around second grade. So I landed, the book picks up a little bit later. And I didn't get an A in English until the sixth grade. So I guess I would say, I don't know if A in English counts as fluent, but I would say it took me about 2 years. So second grade, third grade, those were rough. Fourth grade, I was figuring stuff out, and fifth grade, I was still like, I remember I was still reading picture books, trying to like learn the language as fast as I could, up into late third grade. So yeah, about 2.5 years.
What was it like being in another country for the first time?
What was it like? I'll tell you, the real thing is, like, I didn't know the rules to anything. like you're trying to always figure out the rules. And by that, I mean, like, really everything with like complicated rules. Like, I didn't know the rules to American football. I had no idea how to play basketball, right? So like, you embarrass yourself a lot not knowing that you can't double dribble a basketball. But the other was the rules to just like how people play with each other, right? Like, if you're kind of like out there, I don't know if you're out there on a basketball court and you're by yourself and there's a couple guys and they're shooting around, or girls in there, and you're asking yourself, like, how do I sort of go up and talk to them and just play, like, or whatever it might be you want to do. You want to join people to do stuff, that kind of the social rules of, well, you could just walk up and say, hey, can I join you for a game? But somebody's got to tell you, well, you can do that. You got to go do that. So a lot of it was just like social things like that. I didn't quite grasp how to be a part of a group for a long time. So that was the hardest thing. I was always kind of wanting to know that stuff. I was like, another one would be, how do you get invited to people's birthday parties? The answer is like, just be friends with them, right? It's like, it's pretty simple, but it's a little bit different. And where I lived in Iran, we were just like a really big family, like I never had to wonder whether or not my cousin was going to invite me to his birthday. Like the whole family would just show up. All my friends were, cousin types and things like that. So just that sort of thing, just knowing the rules.
Why did your dad not want to go with your mom to America?
Well, a couple of reasons. He didn't convert to Christianity. He's Sufi Islam, which is a subset of Islam. So he wasn't in trouble. He didn't. But the other was, he had his dad and his mom, and they were very old at that point. And he took care of them. And was sort of the breadwinner for a lot of people. He kind of ended up, he was the guy who, in some ways was, taking over for my grandpa. He was a dentist and he worked in Isfahan. And so, yeah, he had a lot of different people who depended on him. If you were to ask me sort of more seriously, should he have come, then yeah, I think he should have joined us. But everybody gets to make their choice.
My question is, what part of the story do you connect with the most?
What story do I connect? Well, I'm, quite a lot of it. It's my story. It's really funny. There's a character in there named Kyle, and he becomes the best friend. His real name in the real world is Blake. And Blake's been my best friend since the time of that book. And just yesterday, he was over at my house. He also lives in New York. He's a comic book artist. And so we've been friends ever since then. And we spent Thanksgiving together a couple days ago. And he's sort of been a real brother to me all that time. So I really like this section where I go to his house and wreck his bathroom, because that was something that was really fun to share with him, and he just read the book. And so I really, the character of Kyle is the character I really like.
What inspired the title of your book?
Title. So Everything Sad is Untrue is actually a phrase from a book that I was reading a lot when I was your age, which is The Lord of the Rings. There's a section in it where, this is like spoilers for Lord of the Rings in case you haven't seen the movie, but there's a section where Gandalf, the big grandfatherly wizard character, he's like sacrificed himself for the hobbits, and I think he's dead, and it's the saddest moment of the book. The main characters, Frodo and Sam, are really mourning, and they're deeply, deeply sad. And right around this moment, they're sort of sitting in the darkness in this sort of wilderness. No, they don't know what to do. They hear the sound of laughter, and they hear that Gandalf is approaching. They go running to him, overjoyed, and Sam Gamgee asks this question that I thought is just such a lovely and naive and hopeful question, that he says, well, Gandalf, is everything sad going to become untrue? As if just because Gandalf, has returned, all of a sudden every possible sadness in the world is going to go away. I love that. I loved how hopeful that was. I love that it was, a question that wonders if maybe, on a far enough timeline, things can be made better and good, and that, and he really sort of claims that, like Sam is the hopeful one in the story, even when things get really, really rough. And so I thought, this was a character, my character, who was also in a really difficult spot, and sort of, claiming a better future, even in a present that wasn't. So that was why I liked that title.
How long did it take you to create the book?
The whole book took about 13 years. But like I said, it was, as I said, like I said is incorrect. As I said, it's the version that is sort of from the perspective of the kid. That took about 5 years. Yeah.
What was the first draft like? Talk a lot about that.
What was the first draft like? Well, the first draft was an essay collection. So it was really, you know what it was it explained a lot of law and history and stuff like that in a really dry way. Because I did a lot of research for this book, and everything from the history of Iran to, you know, the big sort of what we call, you know, like a national epics that, you know, there's a big poem. It's actually right here. It's this book. It's called the Shahnameh. And if you can't tell how thick this book is, this is my face, and it's about half as thick as my face. So it's a big old book. Stuff like that. I was doing a lot of reading about that. And so the first draft was really dry. Like it didn't have a lot of characters and scenes. It was just trying to get down all that information of like, okay, where were we? What years? What were we doing? So that was kind of it was a pretty bare skeleton.
Do you want to ask your next question on your second question?
All right. Do you ever feel like giving up on the writing?
Oh, all the time. I feel like, I mean, I couldn't if I wanted to. It's, you know, one of the things that happens in life is you really have to figure out what you want to master. You know, I'm not saying I've mastered writing. I'm saying you have to figure out what you want to master. And at first, you know, when I imagine that, I imagine like how you go up a skill tree. Like if you ever play video games, like how do you gain levels as a character on something, right? And to do that, like, let's say I wanted to be a carpenter right now. I love woodworking. I love carving wooden things. The first thing you do is you have to, you have to map the space. Like you don't even know, like if I told you right now, maybe you guys might know a lot about carpentry, but let's pretend you're me, you know nothing. You don't even know where to begin and what you don't know, right? You don't even know what the world is. All I know is I want to make a little Pikachu out of wood. How do I do that? And you go, okay, so the first thing you got to do is map the space. And that's like your apprenticeship stage, right? You're just an apprentice. You have to go find somebody or go on the internet, whatever it might be. And you have to figure out what are even the tools that we use? Like, what are their names? You have to, when I say map it, it means you have to get the words that you use in that industry. What is an awl? What is a bevel? What are these things? And then you have to define them. So, okay, so that's your apprenticeship stage, is just knowing what the tools are. Then you got to get to your craft stage, your craftsman stage, craftswoman stage, where now you know the tools and you can roughly use the tools to solve problems. So if someone were to come along and say, hey, like my door doesn't close in the summertime because it gets too big. Like, what do I do? How do you shave an inch off of a door? You could use that. You know how to use the tools because you were an apprentice. Now you're a craftsman. You can start to solve problems with it. But eventually, as a craftsperson, and I don't know how long it'll take you, you have to create a master work. You have to, and what is the idea of a master work? It's, you don't just use the tools to solve a problem. You use the tools to create something, maybe something hopefully that nobody's ever seen before. Now there you've mastered something, because now you don't even need to have somebody come to you and say, I have a problem, here's my door that's too big. You're thinking, what if I could use this wood to make a dragon? Or what if I could make a door that's shaped like whatever you want? You're limited only by your imagination at that point, because your hands and your mind can create using the tools of that trade. That's a really hard level to get to. And it's a level that you're going to have to decide what in your life you want to dedicate yourself to. And you have to pick. You can't be an apprentice in everything, right? You can't be a brilliant mechanic and a code engineer and a doctor and a writer. And I will tell you this, the most satisfying experience on the planet is creating stuff, right? In whatever craft you happen to choose. So I really love that feeling. I want to get to that feeling of being able to be creative in wood, in writing, in making films, and making graphic novels. So so a lot of times I'm very, very discouraged because I'm not hitting the goals I want to hit. but I'm also very aware that that's the most exciting thing that I can do at any given time. It's like, I really just want to go make something, and I want to be good enough at that craft to be able to do that. So, and I'm lucky. I've studied writing all my life. And so when I sit down, I think, oh, what could I create? Usually it comes out in the form of writing. So it would be sort of not impossible, but I would be very hesitant to ever really give it up. Sorry, that was a really long answer. I've been thinking about apprenticeship. I've been thinking about this for a while recently. I like the idea of like leveling up in different things.
Can you tell us anything interesting about the planning or writing process of the book?
Sure. Everybody disagrees with everybody. If you ever want to have a really challenging time, go ask your entire family to agree on one major memory. So often what happens is everybody kind of has a slightly different perspective. And that was definitely the case. Anytime you're writing in mine, I was writing 4 generations in my family. So I remember when my mom read it, she really liked the last draft, but the first draft, she'd be like, I think your description of your uncle's uncle's uncle is a little mean. And I'd be like, okay, tell me more. And so we'd have to come to an agreement on some of those things. And that's always a real challenge. So anytime you're writing your family story, you've got some negotiating to
do. How did you feel when you made your own book?
How did I feel when I made my own book? That goes back to my last answer, which is anytime you make you come to the place where you've made something, and you can kind of stand away from it and say, oh, that's kind of amazing. I will tell you, if I was being truly honest, it is very satisfying. I happen to be very critical of my writing, so I cringe a lot when I have to read it, because or any of my writing, even when it's finished, because I'm always sort of very wishing I could make it better, which is sort of what ends up driving me to the next project. Is I'm like, okay, I did something, I'm proud of this part, but I really wish this part was better. Let me see if I can solve that the next time. So it was a mix of emotions. It was satisfying, but I also very quickly was like, okay, what's next? What can I make again? Once it's done, it's not really for you. Like I had my fun when I wrote it, and then hopefully other people will have fun when they read it. But my fun then comes the next time I get to make something.
Is there anything you regret not putting into the book?
Is there anything I regret not putting into the book? Yeah, it's funny you should say that. I had someone ask me if I would ever write a sequel, and I was like, I had some ideas, and one of them was this character who was a really good friend. I just couldn't fit him in, right? Like, your life is bigger than you can obviously put into a book. And there was a character, his name was Elvis McBride, and he was like my neighborhood friend. In the book I describe, I lived in a very different neighborhood than all the other kids. I would sort of come in for the school. But I did have one friend in that neighborhood, and his name was Elvis. And he and I were the sort of, we were always on our bikes and, getting together. And he was a really funny guy. I had a really great summer with him that I might someday write about. It was a difficult summer because it was the summer right after the Oklahoma City bombing. And so, Oklahoma was in a really difficult place, and it was a really challenging time. And his dad was actually in the FBI. And so there was just a lot of energy around that. And we were all trying to figure out what it was. And also then he and I were just becoming friends. And so that was a really great summer. I will probably put that into something someday.
Did you want to ask your other question?
Have you ever regretted sharing certain parts of your life?
Well, so it's really funny you should say that. I have only ever really had like Zoom calls with folks because since the book came out, because the book came out in the middle of COVID. So I don't think I've had any regrets just yet, but there's always room for some, I suppose. In some ways, when you write a book, again, like I said, as I said before, it's a very you almost kind of end up standing sort of away from it. It's sort of for everybody else to engage with. So I think if people had complaints, they probably wouldn't bring them to me. They would bring them to like Goodreads or Amazon reviews, and I don't read those for my own personal health. So they might be over there though.
Do you have any other books coming up?
Yeah. So the book, so I'm really excited about this time in history called the Silk Road. And the Silk Road is from the 4th century to it's very long. It's the 4th century to the 11th century. And it's basically this network of merchants and caravans that would travel all the way from Eastern China in modern day Xi'an, basically on the ocean almost in Eastern China, all the way across China, which is huge, to modern day Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Iran and all the way. And there were goods being passed all the way maybe to, we know to Baghdad and farther to Venice where the merchants were. And from Venice, it would go to like Ireland. It was basically spanning the entirety of that section of the world. So I love that era of camels with caravans and merchants going back and forth. And I wanted to write a comedy about it. So there's this big merchant who's kind of a con artist. He's always swindling people. And he has a friend who's this young boy who's very serious, very honest. And they have a very odd friendship. And they realize in their caravan really early on that the villages that this merchant has been swindling got really upset, and they each hired a different assassin to come and kill this guy. So the boy ends up having to save him from all these different assassins. And their friendship sort of, continues to grow over time. So it's called The Many Assassinations of Samir, the Seller of Dreams. And it's currently getting, this one's going to have like really classic sort of illustrations by professional artists. And so that's what's happening to it now. And then it'll come out.
Did anyone help you make the book?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. So if you read the acknowledgements in the back, it's quite a lot of people helped. So the first, obviously, like my family, my wife read the book, and her notes are really important to me. A lot of people gave me notes, which is another way of saying they read it and told me the stuff they liked and didn't like. Then, of course, the editor is, he's kind of one of these legendary editors. He edited Harry Potter. He edited The Golden Compass. So he knows a thing or two about, storytelling. And when he read it, he really, goes into the document and puts a lot of editorial notes down. And it will take me about 6 months. He just finished editing the story about the merchant on the Silk Road. And his edits are so big that it takes me about a half of a year to actually achieve his notes, right? So they won't be small things like, what do you think about deleting the sentence? It's huge things like, what if this whole story was from one person's perspective instead of from the third person perspective? To change a story from third person to first person is a really long process. So he gives me big edits, and it's small edits. Sometimes when a joke isn't funny, he'll say that too. And then there's a whole staff of people at the publishing house that help. Someone hires the illustrator, the designer designs the interior, you get a jacket, there's a production person who speaks to the printer, coordinates how it'll get printed. They also coordinate the what they call the technical files. I know way too much about this, so I'll skip it. I'll go faster. Once the production person gets the manuscript, it has to get edited by a copy editor, not my editor. My editor is editing like the creative work. The copy editor is making sure that all the grammar and sense of it make sense. So like if I said something out of date, or if the content, if somebody was wearing a yellow sweater on page 5, they still have to wear a yellow sweater on page 10. All that stuff gets edited. Then the files get sent to the printer. They print like anywhere from 5,000 copies to 50,000 copies to 500,000 copies. Then all those get put on a boat or a truck, shipped to the warehouse of the publisher. At the warehouse, they get unloaded. Then they get shipped to the warehouse of the bookstores. Then finally, it shows up on a shelf. At every one of those stages, there's somebody moving the books or selling the books or talking about it. There's a lot of people.
How has moving from Iran to the US affected you as a person?
I think I assimilate really well. Like I can go into a room of folks and they could be watching football, or they could be playing chess, or they could be talking about music. And I think one of the skills it gives you is that you can sort of walk into the room and kind of match the tone, match the vibe of the room, and kind of try to fit in. That's clearly something I've had to do a lot. So it definitely changed my worldview that way. I tend to be really agreeable, so if someone we're somewhere, I tend to be very chill about most things. I really love to travel as a result. I don't mind being alone. I like traveling alone. I sit by myself and read a lot. So I tend to have a pretty, what they call like an interior life, which is I'm often in my head kind of imagining things. So I'm a little bit of an introvert as a result. I guess those are all ways in which it's affected me.
Do you visit Iran?
No, so I also am not allowed to visit Iran, just like my mom, now that I'm an adult. But I hope someday I get to. That'd be great, actually.
Is there anything you still do or own that reminds you of your Iranian heritage?
Is there anything I do or own? I cook up a storm. So I used to be a pastry chef for a while when I was in New York. So I love cooking, and that's something I definitely got from, there's a lot of cultures that cook, but I happen to cook a lot of Iranian stuff. I love pickling things. We eat a lot of pickled vegetables, not just like pickled cucumbers, which is what people call pickles, but where I'm from, we pickle everything. And I love making my own yogurt. A lot of what I do in the food, I love, grilling kebabs and things like that. So a lot of my cooking kind of lets you know where I'm from. What else? Well, certainly a lot of my writing. I love writing the way Iranians write. So I'll tell you one like kind of this feature of Iranian storytelling is we love stories within stories within stories, which is what the Arabian Nights is, which is what I described to you. It's certainly what this book is, where there's a story about somebody, and they in the story are telling a story, and then you go into that story, and inside that story, there's another one, and it kind of goes down, down, down into like this V shape. And the term for that, there's two terms, because from what I understand, Chinese storytelling can be like that too. So some people call that the Arabian Nights narrative, and some people call it a Chinese box narrative. And that's the idea of that, is the visualization of like little box inside a little box inside a little box. I've heard it described in both ways. And that part of the world, storytelling is often like that. So that would let you know. A lot of my editors are always like talking to me about that. That's just the way I think about stories. So I tend to love that.
How do you make cream puffs?
How do you make cream puffs? Well, you got to start with a really good pas de choux. Pas de choux is the term for the dough, and that dough is kind of hard because most dough you have flour and water and some kind of fat, so like let's say butter or lard or whatever, and you just knead it together. And of course you need the leavening agent, which is yeast. It's a living organism that makes the bread rise, so it's not a flat bread. So really all you do is you mix all that stuff up and then you leave it alone and let the yeast rise. The difficult thing about cream puffs is that you cook the dough. So you got to get your skillet out, you got to get a fire on, you got to throw the ingredients in there and you cook it, and it gives that sort of like the flavor that pot au choux has, and it helps it to rise and create that little cavity. That's where you put all the cream. So how it all really comes down to that. I mean, most people, as long as they're not goofing off, they can make a really good tasting cream. But the real skill is whether you can make a really good tasting dough, which in this case is called choux. That's the short answer.
What would you say your mission and purpose in life is?
My mission and purpose in life?
Yes, your reason for life.
That's a good question. I think every book in the world, I think every art piece in the world is functionally trying to convince you of something. And what they're trying to convince you of is what you should most value in life. And I think it's actually the danger in life is to go around thinking that art isn't doing that. So you might look at a sticker book and say like, oh yeah, what's the big message in this sticker book? It's not, it's just frivolous. It's a sticker book. And of course, it's easier to tell if you're reading a book like a dystopian sci-fi novel, what it's trying to tell you, because usually they tell you. But I think all art, and George Orwell is actually this essayist. He wrote a novel called 1984, but he also wrote this essay in 1945 called, that date might be wrong, but he wrote it in the 40s, called All Art is Propaganda. And what he was really trying to say was that all art, as I just explained, is convincing you of how we should live, what is the most important thing in life. And so in this book, for example, the character of Khosrow, he's kind of looking around and seeing that the individuals in his life, they're each sort of moving through their own lives, whether consciously or subconsciously, with a mission. And that mission is to serve what they most value. So if they value themselves the most, then they're making a whole lot of decisions that make their own lives easier. Or if they value money the most, then very clearly they're serving their master of money. Or beauty. If your master is beauty, then you're always going to feel less than, but you're always going to be chasing. And then he starts to look at characters whose mission and whose sort of first priority are more noble things. And that's where this character is kind of coming, what they say, like coming of age. He's starting to learn the adult lessons in life. And the lesson that he's trying to impart, certainly to each of you, is don't pretend you don't have one. Everybody's got a list. Everybody's got a number one at the top of that list. And I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it will rule your life. That just express. So in some ways, I've evaded your question, because the mission of this book isn't to tell you what your mission should be, but it's to convince you that you absolutely have one, whether or not you consciously believe it or not. And as a result, it would probably behoove you, it would probably improve your life to consciously decide what should be that number one position. As long as you consciously decide it, I think you'll probably be at least a little bit more aware of what's going on in your behavior. So that's certainly what I was trying to achieve with this book. Does that help? That was a tough question, by the way.
So I wanted to ask a couple questions that came from our other class, and we're getting towards the end of our time, but I thought one really important question that came from my other class was, why do you think it's important to share your story?
Well, it's certainly no more important than anybody else's, but it's also no less important. And I think those two things are really hard to keep in mind. Often I find that, I mean, if you're being honest, you sort of go back and forth between thinking you're the most important and the least important. And the reality is you're neither. So in some ways, I suppose I try to keep an even-handed idea that it's just as important, and I'd like to, and it's the only story that I can tell, so I chose to tell it. And I hope that there's a place for it, and that's why, you know, and the scarcity in that situation, the thing that's the most scarce is attention, right? Not everybody gets to tell their story. Not everybody has the opportunity. And even when they do, not everybody has the time to listen to you. So when somebody reads your book and gives you whatever time it takes to read it, so let's say if you're a really fast reader, it takes you what, like 8 hours, 6 hours? I don't know. People talk about being fast readers and it blows my mind. For me, it's going to take like way longer than that. I'm a very slow reader. That's a lot of attention that they're giving. And that when people write me and talk to me about the book, that's the thing that I think of to say. I'm always really thankful that they gave me their time and attention. That's the gift. So I didn't, you know, you kind of, why is it important to write your story? Well, it was important for me personally. Anything after that was basically a gift that other people have given me, which is their attention. And I try to tell them how grateful I am.
Thank you. Do you have any closing thoughts or other things you were hoping to share with us today that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
Right, we hit some serious business. I liked that. We got to the mission in life. I think that's probably the reason I love that question is because it gets to this. It gets to what are we even doing, kind of. And I thought so. I thank you for that one. That one was a good question to always ask yourself. No, I'm really, you know, I think the rest of the kind of, I got to also talk about the central idea of that book is this kid kind of watching his mom and asking, why did she do all this? Like, why would she make that decision? Why would this happen? And, you know, I spoke to that already, which is that was what was the most important thing. And she was gonna, everything else that's after 2 on that list is going to serve number 1. That's what happens to everybody. And so he really I got to have that in my life. I got to see that close up and really see the effect of that. And that made a really strong impression on me. And the other one is the other sort of theme of the book is in some ways, like, you know, if you're a refugee, there's a very broadly speaking, you're part of this like very broad group of people who are by definition the outsiders. They come into your community, they show up, and they try to make themselves welcome, right? They try to make themselves indisposable. Like one of the things I always thought about as a kid was, I want to go get a good job. I want to study hard. I want to be like somebody that other Americans are like really happy he's an American. Like everybody's really happy that like, I don't know, like the best basketball players in the world, you know, were American for so long. Like everybody was really happy that Michael Jordan's American. Why? Well, because he was a credit to America. He made America proud. You know, and that's true of like Venus Williams, Serena Williams. In some ways, like you come here and you think these thoughts, you think like, well, how do I make everybody else proud that I came to America instead of like Australia? And one of the things I always try to impart to people is, you know, if you imagine that somebody is thinking that in the room with you, one really kind thing you can do is really just say like, hey, I'm glad you're here. Like you're welcome, whether or not you're Michael Jordan. That's a really great sort of approach if you see somebody who's an outsider. And everybody kind of in different rooms is an outsider, right? It's not just a refugee. It's just somebody who doesn't belong in any given place at any given moment. And that can happen to anybody depending on where they go. So I guess that's the other part is, you know, it's a real kindness to kind of take a look around any given room and see who might be thinking that or feeling that and saying, hey, it's not gonna hurt me at all if they say, hey, come sit by me. I'll tell you the rules. I'll tell you how you can engage with everybody. Like that kind of tour into that room is a really that's a really noble thing to do. And so I'd encourage you to try it out.
Did you still want to ask that last question? Okay. I had one more big question. Sorry.
What is something you would risk your life or something that or everything that you have in order to obtain or accomplish, whether it's something moral or like an object?
I would really like so I'm a father, I have a son, he's 9. There's not a lot of things that I would, another way to think of that question is, what is so important that I would risk my son not having a dad for? You know what I'm saying? And there's not a lot I would risk these days. When you become a dad, you realize that you've got to make sure you're around so that you can take care of the little guy until he gets big enough to do that. So, you become pretty risk averse, as they say. But I will tell you, I would give up a whole lot to make sure he gets. So he's going to have a whole lot better life than me, right? In terms of just like, I can afford to buy him cereal. And when you're a kid and you walk through the cereal aisle and see him, you're like, whoa, I want some of that. So he's going to be able to have cereals. He's going to be able to, get a lot of birthday presents, let's say. But I would sure like to make sure he also gets some of those lessons that I learned from having a harder childhood. There's some real blessings that come with having a childhood where you get toughened up, and some of that is just determination and grit and perseverance. Like, I tend to be a very what's the word, like, driven person. I try to, and those are the kinds of things that are harder to give when I'm answering this very honestly. It's very challenging when you go from my childhood to say where we're sitting now and say, okay, how do I make sure that my son gets those skills? So the short answer to your question is, if I can figure out how to raise him to be strong and wise and gentle and kind, that would be great. That's the thing I focus on these days.
So we just want to thank you so much for sharing with us today. Our whole class was super excited to have you here. And for your honesty, for sharing your story, both in your book and answering all of our questions. I really appreciated your thoughts on just hospitality and being kind to others, and welcoming them into our community. Here at American Canyon, we have a really diverse group of students, people that come from all over the world, and their families. And it's a beautiful place when we are the type of people and the type of community that really is open and loving towards others. And that's one of the best things to me about being here with these students, is just seeing example after example of students who are looking. They're actually actively looking for people to include. And I hope that as we continue learning about, the more we learn other people's stories, I feel like the more we understand how important it is. When you don't know somebody, you don't know what they've been through, you don't have as much compassion. But having the opportunity to hear from you and hear from each other helps us to grow our hearts and grow that love. And so we really appreciate your message to us today and just bringing all of those thoughts. So thank you very, very much. And we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. I'm going to just wrap it up. Kate, did you want to say anything to wrap us up at all?
Oh, there's nothing I can add to this. This was a fabulous class, wonderful questions, and I think it was just a great experience. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ann, Ms. Grant, and thank you, American Canyon 8th graders.
When we were on Zoom last year, at the end of every class, we just waved goodbye.